things off. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Ask the Analyst session for the 2025 9-Grid for Talent Acquisition. I'm John Kennard, content editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and I will be your host for today's session. Founded in 1996, Fosway Group provides in-depth advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates, as well as independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. Before we launch into the main body of the session, let me also take this moment to tell you about the Fosway Corporate Network. It's a private network for corporate HR, learning and talent leaders, offering deeper access to data and insights behind the 9-Grids and realities research, monthly virtual roundtables on key topics, private analyst time, and accelerated buying support. There's much more besides this. Do contact us if you're interested in finding out more. This year's research finds that much of the disruption in TA is structural, as TA teams reckon with the automation of both candidate sourcing and job application. Successful recruitment must now be predicated on process redesign, AI fluency, data insight, with much of the work done before roles are even made public. I'm delighted to go through this research today with lead analyst on this, Sven Elbert, as well as Fosway CEO and founder David Wilson, to dissect and discuss all the findings in this latest iteration of the 9-Grid for talent acquisition. Housekeeping notes before we get started. There's a Q&A session at the end. Ask questions throughout. Do use the chat function. Post your questions within there. Play nicely, as we say. We're going to get into a bit of exploratory stuff beforehand, where David tells us a little bit more about the background behind the research process. So questions at the end. We'll hand over to Sven to talk about the 9-Grid itself. But before we do, David, tell us about the research process.
He says, trying to remember to put it on, not take it off mute. So good afternoon, everybody, from me too. We normally just do a couple of quick slides at the beginning, as John said, just to give you a bit of context. So the research that we're going to talk about now is the sort of tip of a very big iceberg. That's a mixture of a kind of an all year round process plus a big peak of activity, obviously leading up to the publication of the 9-Grid itself. It's a large body of work. There's a lot of input that comes from our corporate research network members, roundtables, surveys, inquiry processes, and also private advisory work that we do in the background. We also run a structured data capture process with the vendors themselves, including briefings and demonstrations and so on. And also get a lot of obviously interim briefing and activity across the year, not just from corporate customers, but also from the vendors themselves and things. So all of that huge amounts of activity ultimately gets distilled together with a kind of formal customer reference process that then leads us to the 9-Grid. The vendors included in the 9-Grid are based on effectively those relevant to our target audience, which is typically EMEA headquartered enterprise type organizations. So those are the vendors actively in use within those organizations, the vendors they're considering, plus some of the innovator companies that Fosway believe have the potential to push their way into that quite quickly. We've been obviously tracking this for many years, so we've been looking at these trends over time as well. There is no pay for play. Your vendor can't buy their way onto a 9-Grid, and they also can't buy their way off of a 9-Grid or decline to be included. That's basically purely an analyst decision, influenced, as I said, by our corporate network. Although there's a lot of different industry, a lot of sources here, one of the things that's really important to know, although we're doing quite a deep process with the vendors, the vendor input is actually secondary to the whole process. That actually the primary analysis point of view and the primary audience this is aimed at is the corporates themselves. So it's really what customers say that matters the most, especially when we start talking around things like customer, who's being considered for decisions, what execution, what advocacy picture we're seeing like. So in summary, we have lots of data from lots of sources. It's constantly being built each year. The analysis process, though, is zero-based, so it gets redone from scratch each year in terms of particularly things like the functional assessments and so on we're doing. And then obviously we're pulling that all together for you and publishing that as a 9-grid. The 9-grid image is just the tip of the iceberg. You should, one of the things we will always say is read the reports. The report itself includes a lot of market trends information, both market and solution trends. It includes descriptions about the actual 9-grid process and also about the different dimensions of it, the 5 different dimensions that go into it. We would always recommend that you read those reports. There are also explanation guides that are also available to talk about things like zone positioning and trajectory and so on and things like that as well. So with that, just as as I think I'll hand over to Sven really to talk about the specifics of the talent acquisition 9-grid for this year.
Yeah, thank you, David, and hello everybody from my side as well. Welcome to this session. I think the important thing here on this one is obviously the functional model is in play for many, many years. We keep it updated every year. So for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, we already have quite a lot of AI features embedded throughout this functional model. They go into these buckets, these little building blocks, which cover basically the full talent acquisition funnel from attraction into hiring, but also into onboarding and then into the first 90 days beyond that even. So I think that's really important to understand where we focus in on functionally. We obviously also have HCM models and things like this, but for this particular analysis, we focus here on these kind of building blocks that you see here, which is a big driver for obviously the potential assessment, which you see on the 9-grid then, where we assess the vendors on scope and sophistication of these solutions. So if you flip over to the 9-grid slide, as David said, this is not just the image of the 9-grid, but also there's a long report that looks at trends and headlines. And I'll probably dive into a few of those first before then we look at maybe some of the interesting vendor movements that we have seen, and then we can open it up for questions. So I think it's for the second year in a row that the talent acquisition market is under pressure. The economy obviously has chilled. TA is one of the first always to feel that, and TA budgets are down again. Also, the candidates, there's more candidates in the market, so everybody is kind of finding looking at a bigger haystack, basically, because they get more applications and they need to dig through this haystack, if you like. And they are having to look for that needle in the haystack that they kind of need to find, that like quality candidate. And the candidates at the same time also have, AI tools at their fingertips now. So it's very easy nowadays to, improve your CV. There's a whole kind of sense of fraud detection and so on coming along. So I talk about finding a golden needle in the haystack. Maybe it's only a golden plated needle, right? If that makes sense. So you kind of need to look really deeply. And that is obviously what TA has to adjust to, because oftentimes in the past we were in the skills scarce environment. It was really more important to be quick and fast, and now you really have to sift through more candidates and look for quality, and that is more work actually, where AI obviously can help with a lot of the things on the attraction side, but we're also seeing obviously a lot of strategic interest from buyers in assessment solutions, so making assessments of candidates through psychometric or skills-based assessments and these kind of things. So I think that's why we also include, again in this year, more specialists from that particular assessment segment, if you like, on the grid. So the specialists are the little squares, and the obviously TA suite providers or wider suite providers, HCM suites are sometimes included as well, are the circles. So I think, obviously AI is really now around for obviously quite a long time, generative AI now for a couple of years, and a lot of the vendors have invested in this. Some of the solutions that offer real transformation beyond writing job descriptions and so on are gaining a lot of ground and are accelerating in terms of growth. They are probably stemming themselves a little bit against that heavier, more difficult market conditions and still growing above the market average. So I think that's really important to mention. What's really interesting from a buyer's perspective, also, if some of you are looking up for, a renewal point that might be coming up, a lot of the vendors have or are in the process of adjusting their pricing models, making them a bit more flexible, a bit more outcome-based, maybe trying to offer lower base pricing. Obviously, they are under pressure, particularly at the lower end. Smaller companies maybe have stopped hiring entirely. So why would we even need an ATS? Obviously, there's good reasons to still have one. But obviously, the vendors need to react to that environment, and many have made simplifications and bundling things together. So I think really a good moment for your next renewal discussion when that comes up to dive into that a little bit. And in terms of obviously EU AI Act coming live or being in place and becoming into effect 2nd of August next year, this is now really shaping how AI is getting adopted by many of the corporates. Those rules are now visible. Recruitment HR is considered a high-risk activity under that regulation. And obviously companies need to prepare themselves for that. In terms of innovation, overall, basically, there was probably, in the past years, there was always, in different pockets where you could see like vendors backfill functionality or particular areas like candidate experience where they were investing a lot. For example, onboarding sometimes and so on. Now this year, it's really mostly around AI. So almost all the innovation was AI driven. So that has led us also to start off a separate project, which we will maybe come up, talk a little bit about later as well, to dive into that even further than we have done here. So I mean, these are just some of the highlights, if that makes sense. The report has obviously quite an in-depth view of those kind of key headlines, market and solution trends. So I would urge you to check out the full report. Maybe let's look a little bit at the vendors, if that makes sense. So in terms of movements, obviously, first of all, it's really important to say that there's value in every zone of the 9 grid. So don't just look to the top right corner. Depending on what type of organization you are, you obviously might look into different zones and find really good vendors in those as well. But I'll start there. I think an interesting one this year was a reclassification of Eightfold AI, who is historically, we have seen them as a specialist in this market, focusing a lot, obviously, on AI, telemobility, candidate relationship management. As a matter of fact, they have historically been not really far off from being functionally equivalent to a suite. There were only a few components missing, and they have backfilled that now. And we're now seeing, obviously, buyers acquiring Eightfold also more from a suite play perspective. So I think that's an interesting shift. It's the first vendor actually on the talent acquisition 9 grid over the years who has shifted from a specialist to a suite kind of play. We've seen that on learning systems, David, already a couple of times in the past. So, but I think this is an interesting one to point out. And obviously, in the zone, there are obviously a few others, both talent acquisition suite providers, but also other specialists like, Vonk, Phenom, and so on. I think it's definitely something where we see that the AI players are accelerating in terms of their capabilities, and some of the legacy providers are obviously significantly moving backwards. If you think about it, the placement in the zone is what we call trajectory. So if most of the innovation is driven by AI, so those people, you can think of it as being at the top of the zone. They typically have bigger AI innovation or greater accelerating in terms of their innovation on AI than compared to themselves maybe previous year or compared to the market as a whole, right? So the market as a whole is also innovating very quickly. Some of the other interesting new inclusions, obviously like Sapia AI is a specialist. You can see them in potential challenger. is one of those assessment providers doing some really interesting stuff for many industries. Talk pushes a new inclusion, also really quite an interesting AI player. Who else? I think notable movements. Jovio has made it from potential leader into strategic challenger. So they're also a specialist that focuses a lot on the upper part of the funnel, historically a lot of programmatic advertising, but now also further functionality to help and agentic AI coming or in the suite. Gaia in Quad Challenger, a really interesting specialist, has rebranded from Social Recruited, also seeing quite some strong momentum. And quite innovative. Talents Connect, a German headquartered provider, historically started in career sites and has built those out. So I think you get the gist. There's a lot of there's a lot of innovation. ePloy actually got acquired quite recently by Access Group, so that obviously was after the publication. So a UK headquartered suite player. Yeah, so I'll maybe stop here going through the vendors. David, anything from your side maybe you wanted to add or comment on from your side?
I think the one thing I was going, and it's actually more of a question back to you, is so one of the things that we sometimes hear a lot around when we publish 9grid is like sometimes the position of the HCM providers within this. So looking obviously with Workday is in a strategic leader with a kind of left trajectory around that. Oracle and SAP in strategic challenger. Do you want to maybe comment on, so there's obviously a really big headline battle between HCM and the suite leaders, and then you've got a lot of the innovation agenda, the disruption agenda coming more from specialists within that. Do you want to maybe comment on that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Workday, so all of the HCM providers that you mentioned are, because of the economic situation, there's a big pressure for corporates to consolidate into a single suite, right? So this is what causes them to have really strong attach rates from their existing base, where they're basically kind of trying to replace in bigger HCM deals, maybe a TA suite player or something that obviously is doing the work currently. And that obviously means that they are a viable choice for a lot of companies, and they are able to successfully deploy and implement and use the solution. Oftentimes, however, they do need some, on some of the edges, they need some augmentation, maybe if that's the right word, by some specialist players who in certain areas obviously provide more disruption or competitive advantage when you are competing for talent in the race for talent. So I think from that perspective, definitely they are very important to track, and they do partner quite strategically with some of those specialist players as well. So I think Workday, obviously, with the left side trajectory, obviously, despite strong attach rates, when we look at performance, we are looking at customer and market performance. So you can obviously then guess where that might come from, the left side trajectory, right? So I think those are, I guess, some of the things to mention with regards to that. But Oracle and SAP, obviously, is a bit behind in terms of that. Workday has done an acquisition, which obviously has also helped fledge out a lot of the TA functionality recently. SAP investment on the module has gone down a little bit. There's a bit more investment on onboarding which they have done, and some other parts like the new recruiter experience. So yeah, I mean, does that answer that a little bit? I mean, we can maybe.
Yeah, I think the thing I would just add to that is, and this is very important, particularly obviously for the vendors out there, and TA specific vendors. There's always this degree of sometimes pushback, right, around the fact that there's a vested interest position, which is saying, you know, the ACM providers are really not as good as being rated. But the reality is there are an awful lot of customers who have made that decision to it. They may, as Sven said, also need other elements of the ecosystem to make it work as effectively, or even to make it work better. But at the end of the day, the pressure, particularly within the current economic climate, is actually for consolidation. And that this is being imposed on TA teams. We are actually really trying to assess not just, if you like, the hype and Kool-Aid that comes from those vendors themselves, but also, you know, the reaction from the TA teams as part of the satisfaction process. And that's obviously where sometimes we see a discrepancy between what IT / the HR function believes versus what maybe specialist teams. And we see the same on learning as well. So, but it's a very important, because it's one of those things that's almost the unasked question is, why are these, you know, why are they where they are? And the answer is because an awful lot of customers have made that bet. So maybe we should go into questions.
Questions, yeah, we can open up for questions for sure, yeah.
Certainly. Thank you, Sven and David, so far. I'm going to go in reverse chronological order. Gunilda, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your first name correctly, asked a question about compliance. Obviously, there are different compliance areas depending on where you are in the world, but the question, I guess, would be more general, Sven, and plays into something from the report about compliance and innovation in the EU. Is there anything you can say on that? Obviously, providers in the EU would adhere to EU compliance.
Yeah, right. So there are obviously, with the EU AI Act, there's now obviously some legislation in place that vendors have to follow, irrespective of where they're headquartered, and obviously the corporates as well. So that puts obviously a burden on both sides, both corporate and vendor. In terms of US providers, if that's the question, being maybe more or less compliant, there is some legislation in the state of New York and some other US states, which basically requires vendors in those markets to have external bias and fairness assessments, for example, by an external third party. This is currently not a mandatory requirement under the EU AI Act. However, we see from the market and the buyer side in the EU that this is a clear expectation. So we've done an analysis, 48% of the vendors, 48% of the vendors currently have an external audit report that they can provide to their customers or even publicly available, which is a third-party audit of their AI that looks at fairness and bias and these kind of things. So it obviously varies a little bit by type of AI. So the European vendors, if it comes to that, are probably, some are lagging behind actually. So because the state of New York was really quite fast with that, there's actually, from a proportional perspective, slightly higher propensity of the US vendors that actually have that. But it's not, I don't want to narrow it too much into that. There's also obviously GDPR and other kind of things. So definitely, if it's a more startup-y kind of organization in the US, I probably would be a bit more digging a bit deeper into that, to be honest. It depends a little bit on the type of solution that you're looking for, Gunilde. If it's a more established provider who's around for longer, who's experienced also with global customers, then certainly you can expect it. There's also an interesting ISO certification, the 42001, that can help significantly, just like the ISO 27001 and others, for the GDPR discussion, if that makes sense. Long answer, I hope that covered that.
Thank you, Sven. Anything to add, David, or?
No. But I think the 48% statistic is quite interesting.
Yeah. Magdalena, I've seen a question come in from you. It's a bit more general about data collection for the 9-grids. I'm going to keep it on the talent acquisition 9-grid itself and maybe ask that one later. Sergio has asked a question about skill-related use cases, and I don't know if you've seen that, Sven, whether you've got a comment there. It's about do newcomers have an advantage considering building skills from scratch um, against more reliable talent marketplaces?
Yeah, so obviously skills-based hiring is a big topic, where in the past, obviously, I guess the modern solutions are now completely relying on skills ontologies, on AI to figure that out. So compared to the very old legacy providers, I think definitely, yes, you are right, they are in an advantage position. A lot of the providers have invested in that, but not all. So that is definitely something where I would recommend that you go deep into the engine room, if that makes sense, and look deeply into what the provider has to offer, or talk to us in more detail, if that makes sense, if you have a specific question around some of the providers. But it's definitely something where you see a lot of differentiation. Some are actually taking market intelligence data on skills and other factors into almost like a strategic workforce planning view into the consideration, and drilling that into the talent acquisition and talent management processes, so that you actually get a really good feedback loop running between the strategic side, the planning side, the market side, and then what is happening internally. So those would be folks like Eightfold or Beamery, for example, that do that, compared to, you know, some of the legacy providers who are just like maybe starting to skate into that direction, if that makes sense. But think of it also as something where you kind of need to have a bit of a mind shift on the selection criteria, how your managers actually ask some interview questions. So it's more than just looking at, you know, for internal mobility purposes and so on. So there is a bit of a cultural and organizational shift that also needs to happen and take place. And maybe there are also some interesting skills assessment tools that have come up. For example, let's see, like Arctic Shore, Spotted Zebra, those kind of companies, where they are really doing some quite innovative stuff around that in terms of the selection and hiring process through psychometrically validated models. Assess first is another example. So there's a few other examples. Obviously, didn't want to mention only a few, but I mean, that gives you maybe a flavor.
I think the other thing, the second part of the same question, reading it on the chat says, you know, how does this like what the internal and external view? So I think the other side of this is the increasing presence of things like talent marketplaces on talent mobility types as the bridge between internal and external recruitment. And obviously, if you've got a hold on external hiring, then effectively you're then more reliant on internal focused talent in order to fill roles and to grow capability as well. So I think the question is very valid in the sense of that. And skills is basically the common language for all of it. Unfortunately, though, making skills work across an organization and joining up the internal and external view of skills, even the different internal views of skills, maybe from HCM or career and learning and so on and things like this, is actually quite a huge challenge for organizations, which is one of the reasons why we've seen some of the skills intelligence and talent intelligence specialists also become quite disruptive around those topics as well. But yeah, I think that whole thing is much more of a holistic play. Skills is like a foundational language, but it's also not necessarily established and correct in many organizations. A lot of organizations are really battling to make that work in a reasonable way, but there's sort of one at the moment, there's only one direction of traffic on that. So we're likely to see more of it, not less.
Right.
Thanks, David. Back to let's ask a question from Catherine. Given the volatility in the market, should procurement teams be cautious about buying into long-term contracts? I mean, difficult question to answer, maybe not.
I mean, the volatility, I mean, obviously, if you implement, it depends on what type of organization you are, right? So if you're a large enterprise organizations, obviously, once you have implemented a big solution globally, obviously, some time has already gone past from the contract perspective. So if you are asking with the background of AI innovation, I think that is something where we have some deeper analysis that lets us answer that very specifically for very specific vendors, because you probably then want a vendor that you can trust in terms of their live capability. What do they have live? Is that what you need? What else would they be able to offer you in terms of maybe efficiency gains or agentic AI or whatever? And then maybe how much can you rely on their roadmap? And maybe, I don't know whether they would make necessarily contractual commitments, but how can you maybe rely on roadmap delivery for a particular vendor in general is what we do kind of track as well. So I think from that perspective, I don't see that anything would speak against a longer term contract duration, particularly now since the vendors have flexible pricing models. You might find that they are actually giving you some breathing space in terms of the commitments that you need to be making, and can bake in some flexibility. So 1 year is probably the minimum contract duration nowadays that most vendors in the larger mid-market, mid-enterprise space are expecting. 3 years is probably the norm, and 5 years is probably something, if you commit to a longer period, that would probably give you a bit of your procurement team room to discuss a bit more in depth about options, perhaps, if that makes sense. But this is a very generalized answer. David, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it also depends what we're talking about, because like with any of this, the segments that we analyze, you have anchor solutions, right, which are really the main pillars around which things get built. For a lot of large enterprise, that battle has typically been around what was an ATS becoming a talent suite versus maybe an HCM learning recruiting modules, and so on. And that's still really, the biggest competitive dynamic at that level. Obviously, within the mid-tier and the wider market, it's much more around TA suite to TA suite. In reality, the amount of innovation that most of the vendors are pushing along, most customers struggle to keep up with that anyway, because I think that's the other important part. So I think you have to deconstruct in some ways the problem. You could spend a lot of time switching vendors and never execute on any of them, right? Because that's also the danger, is if you've got to build integrations, you've got to connect into your systems and it's an ecosystem problem, right? TA is an ecosystem problem. The wider HR stuff is a big, even wider ecosystem problem, including a TA ecosystem and other ones as well. The reality is building that and making it operable, supporting it, managing innovation across it is inherently a much slower activity than organizations would ideally like. That's why we push people to talk about connectors, not APIs and integrations and things like this. But within your anchor suites, I mean, nearly all cases, large companies will look at that as a 3 to 5 year decision, and then potentially around some of their kind of strategic add-on solutions, for example, with companies that have been adopting an eightfold or a phenom or something like this, they're probably also looking at that as a 3+ year kind of commitment, and then trying to build out innovation on top of it. There is so much change coming on, and it's coming from all levels as well. I think when you get into the very niche parts of the ecosystem, there's probably more potential to experiment. But the moment you need to look at holistic company-wide adoption, and then you need to repurpose that for your different contexts, particularly in a large enterprise, right? They're very complex organizations. They're not one size fits all, because they've got very different audiences, geographies, requirements that they're trying to fulfill. Doing that and changing every part of that all the time is almost impossible to do. So you have to kind of make bets. So I think from an innovation point of view, tracking faster innovators and maybe looking at building some of those into your model is a very positive strategy, but you have to do that within a manageable way that you can actually consume and deliver value. And if you keep changing everything all the time, it's really hard to actually ever get to a stable position. And in reality, we know that most customers are quite slow to adopt the innovations that the vendors deliver to them as well. And sometimes the vendors aren't as effective as they could be at enabling that to be easy. So, I think it's a complicated question, but I don't think at the moment we've seen that whilst the economic climate has created financial pressure around TA particularly, that maybe has slightly changed some parts of the equation, it hasn't really caused companies to want to churn vendors faster necessarily. There are certain points where there is a good opportunity for change. Actually, sometimes, funny enough, from a recruiting perspective, specifically in the TA space, if there's a lack of hiring, that is often a good opportunity for a transition point, right? So we've seen that in previous points in the market as well.
Thank you, David. Gunilda, that kind of answers your question from 313 as well about ATSs, I think. There's a question from Bruno at 324. Cornerstone, I don't know if you'd speak on specific vendors, but he's saying that it provides 2 ATSs. How do you see the development of both, Sven?
Yeah, Cornerstone obviously has an ATS module in the Cornerstone suite proposition, and had acquired a specialist solution a couple of years back, which I think was called Talent Link. So we have included the Cornerstone core platform here in this analysis. So David, do you want to comment further on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think Cornerstone. So in earlier iterations, so I think this is the 7th iteration of the talent acquisition 9-grid, and in earlier assessments, we have focused more on Talent Link because it was a more dedicated TA focused solution, and particularly in EMEA was much more relevant to enterprise quality kind of recruiting. Cornerstone already had a TA module and has had that for many years. That absolutely is in use in many companies as part of a suite approach with Cornerstone. But what has become apparent over time, in particular, I think actually they've got off the fence this year in quite a significant way. They just had their Cornerstone Spark events in the US and London, for example, and they're very much now focusing on what they call Cornerstone Galaxy. So that's their kind of overall suite strategy. And obviously within that, trying to push people towards what they're calling bundles around learn, engage, and transform. And the recruitment piece is the recruit module is part of the engage bundle around it. So going forward, I mean, obviously there are still Talent Link customers out there, but I don't believe Cornerstone will be proactively selling Talent Link as a new solution to a new customer. It's pushing much more towards that kind of integrated Galaxy play with recruiting as part of that process. And the reason we still include it is because we've tracked a number of dedicated Cornerstone customers that are specifically been TA only originally, but also as part of that integrated suite play and decision, particularly as per the earlier question, as we've shifted much more towards skills-based hiring, skills-based talent, that obviously becomes hugely relevant. And also with Cornerstone's acquisition of Skyhive, they are also integrating labor market data into their view of skills. So that very much that strategic workforce view that Sven touched on earlier.
Thanks, David. Let's ask Magdalene this question, actually. When you mention collecting customer data, who does that refer to? It could be each and all of them, really, couldn't it? TA leaders, recruiters, end users of platforms, CHROs. Sven?
For the analysis of the 9-grid,
Yeah.
Obviously we look at all of those sources of information. We have quite a few surveys going on, obviously. One is to users of the system. So those would be typically recruiter users, not necessarily hiring manager users, would also be TA leaders, could be CHROs. We obviously then also have a lot of, from the corporate research network, a lot of conversations with TA leaders, with CHROs, which are more one-to-one kind of conversations around their vendors and what works, what doesn't, who plays with whom, and those kind of things. So I think it's all of them, really. David, anything on like weighting or something we want to share, or
Well, as we've said, first of all, there is more weighting put on customer and
It's
corporate input versus the vendor side.
Mhm.
Probably the bit that's maybe missing or not an active really part for us is we're focused generally on the view of, for example, candidate experience from the perspective of the provider rather than necessarily of the candidate themselves, right? So I think most of the view is from the corporate perspective rather than necessarily from a candidate perspective. But obviously, one of the things that we're seeing is, a significant focus, and obviously this is not new, it's been going for a while, around candidate experience and streamlining the hiring process, and as well as scaling and automating stuff and things like this. So it tends to be the professional audience, in other words, the functional buyer, the TA leader, and then obviously the wider HR leader. Bear in mind, of course, we're also looking at this, although we're talking about TA here, we're also looking at the kind of the whole HR perspective, the wider talent organization, as well as the learning functions and stuff as part of our other segment research as well. So we also get an holistic view from that as well.
We do, however, obviously read a lot of research from other
Yeah,
sources, obviously, on this. So there's also a lot of background conversations, obviously, with, say, recruitment agencies and other like job boards and like players in the market that obviously also form input to the research on a wider basis, if that makes sense.
I think the other final comment I would say is a lot of our methodology is focused to trying to really unearth what the outcomes of everything is. So we're not interested necessarily just in the tech and the transfer of their own sake. We're really interested in the impact it has in terms of the ability to hire, the quality of hire, the performance of the employees afterwards, and so on. So we are very much interested in what drives real outcomes for companies, not just what drives a
Which,
recruiting measure, for example.
yeah, adding to that, which obviously is in the current economic climate, something which is really important, both to obviously the TA leaders, the customers, if you like, to justify investment, and but also obviously to the vendors. So we do assess that as well, and quite a few actually have invested in customer success, business value consulting functions, and take that much more seriously than they have in the past. So there's quite a few actually who have invested significantly in, regular business review meetings where they go through ROI figures, not just like candidate engagement or like, the typical hiring statistics like time to hire and these kind of things, but also obviously to the outcome focus. So that is something that we do track very actively. And it is baked into the performance dimension of the model and also into the performance trajectory model. So you would find people typically a bit more right side, both in terms of the placement within a zone or on the right column, if you like, that are stronger at that, typically.
Thank you, Sven. Thank you, David, and thank you, Magdalena, for that question. A question from Sergio. There's some noise in the market around Mackie people from France. This is a question, I think, about the broader prospects of agentic AI. We may well be talking, well, we will be talking about this slightly later in the session as we wrap up. But is there anything you want to say, Sven, on the prospect of agentic AI and the changes it might make?
Yeah, obviously, there, like if you have a YouTube screen and if you have ever clicked on one agentic AI video, you get a gazillion of those. So obviously, it is a very important topic currently, where a lot of the vendor investment is also skating towards. In terms of the reality of that, it is earlier days. The report speaks about pilots being run. With certain target audiences, with niche in niche scenarios where companies are experimenting with that. It's certainly not yet in wider adoption. Obviously, won't comment on noise on particular vendors, but I think as a general observation, it's definitely everybody's focusing on that on their roadmap or has functionality live or is about to get something live, which is part of our AI research project, which we talk about a bit later. But so certainly it is where the transformational part of the AI innovation is probably going to sit, because obviously job description generation and more career side content is nice and good and has its value. And you can obviously prove business cases and things like this with it. But true transformation will come with those more agentic use cases. The general gist is that it will continue to be a human in the loop process. So very autonomous agents are probably still a bit further out, and also corporates are a bit more careful in adopting more autonomous agents. Also, given the EU AI Act obviously coming live next year, some of them have some corporates have maybe started to build their own agentic kind of solutions, even in TA or in HR. And even those will become under significant pressure for documentation, for auditing and compliance checks. So my expectation is that this will, whatever is currently in play in terms of, if you like, custom or bespoke development, is going to skate to a more professional vendor who has enough, obviously, customers to validate the overhead for it, to obviously get all the documentation and compliance checking and all of that kind of things ready, because there is a lot of testing effort involved and so on. So hopefully, I mean, Sergio, we can maybe talk about that specific case if you like offline, but certainly that's as much as I can probably comment on AI agents.
Well, one of the things, just sort of, I was going to just take it in a slightly sideways direction, because I'm not sure we really talked about it much, but Sven, maybe comment on what I would describe as the arms race about the propensity of candidates to use AI tools to massively impact the hiring process, right? So mass applications to many jobs,
That is definitely in play.
custom letters, CVs, whatever. So, and
that is all in
the ability of corporates to adapt. So obviously the corporates adopting AI to change the way that they do the recruiting process, but the candidates are also doing the same things, possibly innovating faster, I would say, and that's creating lots of problems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is what I meant with the needle in the haystack problem. So the haystack is getting bigger because candidates have these AI tools at their fingertips, and it's much easier nowadays to apply to hundreds of jobs while you sleep with very tailored, great CVs that match the job requisition really well, so that the AI would actually detect a good match. So the counter movement, if you like, so how can recruiters spot some of those maybe slightly golden plated CVs, if you like? Vendors are introducing fraud detection tools into the solution. So a few of them have started to release things on it. It's still probably a bit early days, but there's definitely commitment to do more from several leading vendors in the market who've said, "Oh yeah, we need to act on this." So there is a bit of a counter movement on that as well, if that makes sense, which is important to know. I think there was another question there earlier around that.
An early question. That's why I picked it up, because I thought it was something we sort of skirted over, but actually is a huge issue as well.
It is a big issue, right? And also they all sound the same right now. You think, oh yeah, I've read these kind of offer these kind of application letters now a gazillion times. So the sound is even like, if you speak to recruiters, that is definitely what they also perceive as being the reality. And even there are even more sophisticated things where they put AI avatars in front of them and are maybe doing something else. Well, I mean, you can find those things on social media, right? So, but yeah, it's definitely something where we do see that some of the vendors are investing more into fraud detection. Also, when it comes to assessments, right? These psychometric, remember these 5-point scales where you had to like go through like 30 minutes and things like this. This is not the best AI safe kind of assessment anymore, right? Because this is also where you want to be using an assessment provider that actually is not easily gamed by a generative AI model that has vision or something. And there are a few out there who take that really seriously. Some of the more game-based solutions where you actually have very little chance to game the assessment with the use of a generative AI model.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the key thing, is that candidates have agents too, right?
Yeah, right.
So.
Okay, thank you both. And thank you everyone for your questions. If we could move on to the next slide. We're finishing a little earlier than normal because we have many exciting projects to talk about, not least this one. David, I don't know if you want to say a bit on the strategic AI research project.
Yeah, and we decided to talk a little bit more about this time because we're literally about to start to push out some of the outputs, leading actually with AI and TA as one of the markets that we're focusing on. So we've been working since last year on a strategic AI research project that covers all our segments. So it will includes HR and talent and learning and stuff as well. But we're looking to start to announce some of the outputs from that. And when I say coming soon, we're talking out potentially in the next 1 to 2 weeks for the first part of that. One of the things that we've been doing, we actually ran in parallel to the 9-grid process, was an AI assessment for the vendors, looking at vendor roadmaps and trying to understand how extensive their roadmap was. There's so much noise in the market, there's so much hype. Everybody go to a trade show and everybody's an AI vendor now. So trying to tell the difference is very difficult. We know from corporates, they don't really have any understanding about like who really has what and doesn't. So we thought that's one of the reasons we would drill into it. You will see something come very soon from us. One of the first things you'll see is a market assessment paper that is talking specifically around what is AI innovation happening within TA, what are the main areas of activity, and what's the level of things like consensus between the vendors in terms of how many of, what features are in what roadmaps, how advanced are they in their delivery. Obviously you can have a really big story but almost nothing live, so how much has also been delivered and so on. You've got there's a few images on this which are actually extracted from that research, including trying to understand, for specific vendors where they rate. The XY chart that you see with the black background is a comparison of where vendors' roadmap vision is versus their live capability. And some of the radar charts are assessing individual vendor capabilities. We're also looking at overall across the market. The left hand, these Sankey diagrams are looking specifically at the maturity of where it is. So you can see, for example, 33% of AI innovation currently is within the attraction part of the model and so on, but only 27% of that is live. Which actually is quite advanced. That's probably at the moment the most advanced segment, TA, versus some of the other things as well. This project obviously is going to create some specific deliverables, but there's loads of detail, just like there is with the 9-grid. There's loads of a real deep insight behind it. So if you're specifically interested in both in terms of AI innovation and within your TA environment, and obviously the vendors are very interested in what everybody else is doing, what the roadmaps are and how much competitive advantage they've got or not. But for corporates, this is massively important as well. So obviously reach out to us and find out a little bit more information. The other thing is just picking up on what John talked about before. We touched on the corporate membership. So one of the things that we're increasingly doing going forward, and that will also include actually for the 9-grids in 2026, is start to basically have a higher level of disclosure for the corporate members than, for example, the public reports in terms of some of the data and insights behind it. So if you're interested in really understanding more about this and how it could apply to you, or getting input around your ecosystem or the buying decisions or vendor renewals or new requirements and so on, then obviously please contact us around that. That also includes some, can you take it back quickly? That also includes input around things like the accelerated buying support that we talked about earlier. So if you want input around help validate needs, vendor shortlists, and also obviously to accelerate an RFP process or something, we don't run those, but we obviously can provide a lot of input that help accelerate and de-risk them. So, the other thing we just wanted to make you aware of, some of you have wider roles, not just in TA. We used to run every year. So we've been running many roundtables as part of our corporate membership activity for the last few years, We used to run an annual face-to-face multi-roundtable event, which we called the Fosway Symposium. That's the last time we ran that was actually in 2019, just prior to COVID. But we're restarting those as of September. So the first one of those, which is focusing on AI skills and learning, is going to start off in September. If you're interested in that, if you contact Jack, who's on the previous slide, or register interest, we can provide you with a bit more information. That's for corporate attendees only. There will be one, we are also looking to schedule one of these related to HR and talent in the first half of next year as well. So expect these to come back as a regular event.
Great. Thank you, David. Just on your screen there is a couple more interesting bits of research. Obviously, the 9 Grid for Talent Acquisition. Do give it a read if you haven't already. Also, input to our TA realities research, which is in the stages of formulating the infographics, but there's still probably time to have your say about the state of talent acquisition in 2025 and beyond. So that's it for today. Thank you, David. Thank you very much, Sven, for your time, and also everyone who's attended this Ask the Analyst session. There will be more. The next of our 9 grids is Cloud HR, which is going to be in mid-September, but there's plenty going on at Fosway Group before then. So thanks very much, and we'll see you very soon for another Ask the Analyst session. Thank you.
Right.